Okay, this is section 3 of chapter 8, the feudal system. Make sure that you have your notes out. Your objectives for this section are that you should be able to describe the major elements of the feudal system and describe all aspects of the manor system. Actually, sorry, I take that back. The manor system will be section 4, so that should not be there, sorry. Okay, the feudal system and its development. So after Charlemagne's empire disintegrated, you remember from the last lecture that it had problems from within, meaning you had a bunch of people arguing over who should have what land, and then there was problems from without, meaning all of the barbarian tribes and groups that were putting pressure on the empire. So after that had pretty much dissolved, you have a bunch of powerful nobles who've been able to maintain their power in their land, and they're able to even grow more powerful because they can offer people protection in return for their services. So, like, you know, if you will, you know, farm this land and give me this percentage of your produce, then I will protect you in case, you know, some group comes and invades this area. During this time, and so that's pretty much the basis of feudalism, of that system. And you'll notice while we go through this that your vocab words are going to be very, very helpful on your exam. Okay, so land during this time is the basis of wealth and power. So the more land you have, the more powerful you are, the more wealthy you are. Okay, and the land-holding nobles, the nobles that own land, are the lords. So those are kind of the top dogs, okay? And then you have the king, who would be like the supreme lord, and you'd make him king because he's kind of the lord of lords in essence. And so he's relying though on getting protection from other lords. So he's technically protecting all of these lords, but he's not, because he has to depend on them to protect him, because they're going to be the ones that provide him with knights. But in exchange for their help, the king is going to give them lots of land. So they're going to get to use all of these different landed estates. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but those estates actually don't belong to the nobles at first. When this system first develops, they have to return them back to the king when they pass away. So these land grants are known as fiefs. And obviously, the larger of a fief you have, the more money you have, the more power you have. So they range in size from very large to very small. And if you received one of these, you would then become the king's vassal. And a vassal is another word for servant. So now you owe the king. So if the king needs a favor, you owe it to him. And like I was saying, the vassal doesn't actually own the land, but is holding on to it as a payment. It's kind of it's a loaner. And then the vassal could then decide, hey, I've got a pretty decent chunk of land. I'm going to divide it up, and I'm going to give it to lesser nobles. And then those lesser nobles will owe me, so they'll have to serve me. And then they'll become vassals, and that continues on and on until you can't divide up the land anymore. And that's known as subinfeudation. So here on this little chart, you can see the king at the top, and he's made, you know, these two guys vassals, and they have a bunch of land, so they have their lords. And then they have knights, and then, you know, those knights would further divide up the land, and then they would have serfs working that land. Okay, so homage is the ceremony where a man pretty much can become a vassal. This is where the king kind of gives him that honor of saying, I'll give you this piece of land in return for your loyalty. And so that act is known as investiture. So the ceremony is homage, but the actual symbolic act is investiture, and the lord would give the vassal, or the person or the knight, they would give them a little stick or a lance, or sometimes just like a big clump of dirt, of earth, which symbolized that they were allowed to use that land, and that the Lord was promising him his protection, and if anything happened, you know, he would make sure that justice was served. Okay, so the vassal's primary function, meaning their most important function, is to provide military support to the Lord or to the king. So they would have to give the king a certain amount, or to the Lord a certain amount of knights for at least 40 days out of the whole year. They had to promise that they would send him, 10 knights for 40 days of the year that would serve the king or the lord in however he needed them to. If he needed them to go to battle somewhere, that they would be available to the king 40 days a year. The vassal also sometimes had to pay aids. So these would be like big financial payments on special occasions, like if the lord's daughter got married. Back then they used to have things called dowries, and you'd want your daughter to have a decent dowry so someone would marry her. So you want to she wants to have like a lots of money and livestock and those kinds of things. It's kind of like a wedding present in a way. So the vassals would help the lord kind of make this dowry really, really good by paying these aids. Or if the lord's son was going to become a knight or something like that, they would pay money that way. Sometimes they would have to pay ransoms. If their lord or their king was captured during war, they would be expected to pay that ransom to get him back. And sometimes, this is really confusing, you would have a knight who was a vassal, so they were a servant to more than just one lord. So they would be trying to serve, 2 or 3 guys. And sometimes those loyalties would conflict, which would be a problem for the knight. He'd have to decide who he was going to side with. Okay, so the life of the nobility. The life of the nobility centered on the castle. So everything's happening at the castle. This is where the lord lives or the king lives. It's where the jail is. It's where the treasury is. It's where the armory is. So that means like all the weapons and stuff. If a crime has been committed, you're going to go to court here at the castle. And it's not like there's judges and stuff. Usually it's the king or the lord that will determine, who did the wrong thing and what kind of a penalty they should serve. So it's the seat of government here at the castle. Castles are cold and they're damp, so kind of wet and dark. They're not very pleasant. And they're not very comfortable. And that's kind of like, you'll notice things like when we look at the Middle Ages, people have tapestries and stuff on the walls. They're kind of trying to warm up the castle and keep out the draft by putting up those big, kind of pretty much carpets on the walls. And castles aren't meant to be comfortable because they're built for defensive purposes. These are forts. And at first, castles were built on wood or out of wood. And then people realized, oh, wait a minute, these castles will catch on fire and burn to the ground. Let's try building them out of stone. And they would be surrounded by moats, which are like those rivers, making it even more difficult for people to get into the castle. So it's all about being able to defend your home. And so like if there's a battle, all of the people that live out in the field, like the serfs that are farming, they would all run into the castle for safety and to defend it. And I'm sure you guys have seen that kind of thing in movies. Okay, knighthood. In the early Middle Ages, anyone could become a knight. So it didn't matter what your status was. You could be a farmer, you could become a knight. Later on, only nobles, people of noble birth, could become knights. And if you've seen the movie A Knight's Tale, that's kind of Heath Ledger's character's problem, is that he's pretty much a peasant and he wants to be a knight, so he has to kind of lie. And there's like a big penalty, if they find out that he's been lying all this time and wasn't of noble birth and he fakes his papers pretty much. Becoming a knight was a very difficult process, and it started when you were very young. So if you guys remember, kind of like the Spartans, it started when boys were 7 years old, and they would go and they would become a page. And so they would kind of be given in service to another knight who was supposed to be training them. And as a page, they would study, as much as people studied in the Middle Ages, the academic subjects that they would need, horsemanship and hunting and all of that. Then when they were in their mid-teens, they would become a squire. And that pretty much meant that they were like the personal assistant of the knight. And so they would take care of the knight's armor and his weapons and take care of his horse, and they would help the knight get dressed and put all of his armor on, which is like very heavy and complicated, so you need help to put it on. And they would wait on the knight and his family and his guests when they were serving in the knight's home. Then finally, at the age of 21, the boy would become eligible to actually become a knight. And you could become a knight 2 different ways. Sometimes if you were really, really brave on the battlefield, you could become knighted right then and there. But usually you are knighted in a special religious ceremony where there was a big mass in the Catholic Church, and the knight would pray in front of his armor all night before. Okay, so knights would live by this code of chivalry. It's a very strict code that kind of requires certain things of them. So They were expected to be brave in battle, skillful with their weapons, to be honest and generous, that they would be loyal to their lords. They would never attack an unarmed knight. They would always defend the church. They would try to protect the poor. Pretty much that they would just be loyal men who kind of loved justice. So the church is trying, because remember, there's lots of tiny kingdoms everyone's fighting. So the church is going to try to kind of, limit that feudal warfare. And they're going to do two things, and these will definitely be on your test and on your quiz. The peace of God, it didn't let people steal from the church property. So if there's a battle, you can't go into someone else's, some other town's church and steal all of the items in there. Okay, you can't like steal from the altar any of the art or different altar pieces like the goblets they would use for communion and stuff like that. You couldn't do that. And you needed to not hurt civilians, pretty much. That's what it means by non-combatants. So anyone that's not a knight and is not fighting, you can't hurt them. That's not allowed. And then you have the truce of God, which pretty much gave them certain days of the week that they were allowed to fight. So you could not fight from Wednesday night to Monday morning. No fighting allowed. Wednesday afternoon is okay. Wednesday night, not okay. And then you might be wondering, well, what would keep anyone from actually, what would make someone want to follow these rules? What would be the penalty if you didn't follow these rules? And you have to remember that the Catholic Church really has a lot of power, and it's really influenced a lot of people to think, like, if you don't follow these rules, then you're condemned and you're going to go to hell. And most of these knights would really, really care about that, so they would not want to offend the church at all. That's a part of their code of chivalry, is that they would defend the church. Okay, so in peace times, knights want to keep up with their skills, so they want to practice. So they're going to do pretty much mock wars, and that's what tournaments are. So if you've ever been to the Renaissance Fair, you've seen a tournament, or if you've been to the Tournament of Kings at the Excalibur, you kind of get the idea. And the two main events in a tournament are the joust and the melee. And I'm sure most of you have seen the joust, where you have the two knights on horseback, and they have the lances, and they face each other, and they charge each other and try to hit each other off the horses with the lances. And if you go to that clip, that YouTube link that I have right there, it'll take you to a video from A Knight's Tale of the Joust. And you can also look up on the History Channel a while ago, there was a show called Full Metal Jousting, where it was like guys nowadays in this reality kind of competition where they're jousting. Is pretty interesting. So you could check some clips out of that. Then the melee is a team competition where you pretty much had like a full-on battle, and it was in a fenced-in area, so you could have like people would like go attend. You'd have like an audience for the battle, and they'd be cheering people on. And your weapons would be dulled so that you couldn't, technically, you weren't supposed to be able to kill people, but people did die during the joust and during melee. There were accidents. The joust especially is really dangerous, because if you look at a knight's helmet, they have this slit where they're supposed to be able to see, but it's really, really difficult. And lots of times, sometimes people would leave that open on accident, or a splinter of the lance could even get in and go into someone's eye. If you fall off your horse, head injuries, or that lance could go right, through someone's armor, or all sorts of problems. And quite a few men died jousting. So, and even some kings, some monarchs died jousting. Okay, here's your paragraph shrink: order, lord, and customs. So let's review your SRQ. Remember that if I'm going too fast through the slides, you can pause. Number 1, what was land granted by kings to nobles in return for their service called? Number 2, what place was the center of life for the nobility? Number 3, what 2 stages of preparation did a young man go through to become a knight? Number 4, name the strict code of honor that governed knightly behavior. And number 5, what 2 types of activities were part of the typical tournaments among knights? Okay, so some of these questions you will see on your quiz tomorrow.